Welcome to the World of Eora, a news and lore podcast about the Pillars of Eternity games, as well as Obsidian Entertainment's upcoming release, Avowed. Hello everybody and welcome to another episode of the World of Eora. I'm your host Eric, aka Gingerino. Thanks everybody for joining me as we dive into the history, lore, and game mechanics for Pillars of Eternity 1 and 2 as we gear up for the release of Avowed. For those wondering why we pair those games together, it's because they share the same fantasy setting known as Eora. So as the theory goes, as we dive into those Pillars of Eternity games, we can glean insights into Avowed as it undergoes development and understand the nuances of the story and the world better when it's actually released. Today, I'm splitting the episode up into two parts. The first part is going to be the lore of a group of dwarves known as the Pargrunen, I believe it's pronounced. I'll look into that in a second. And the second half of the episode is going to be kind of a reflective piece on 2023, now that that year is over and we walk into the new year of 2024, just like the games that I've played and the experiences I've had and what I'm looking forward to. In that regard. So with that being said, I suppose a happy 2024, everybody. We made it. You survived another year. I don't know what your vibe is that you're going for this year. For me personally, I think I'm going to try to lean towards something along going with the flow of things. I'm not sure what word to use there. Someone today who I talked about said maybe like fluidity or something like that would be a good word to use there. That's kind of the vibe I think I want to go for this year with my own personal life. But yeah, what vibe are you guys going for this year? What's your 2024 year going to be about? But yeah, so there will be a split in the episode today. When I'm done talking about lore-related stuff, I'm going to kind of just talk about my top 10 games, or I'll probably boil it down to top 5 perhaps, just to keep it short. But for now, we're going to talk about this unique group of dwarves that we actually might have, not these dwarves directly, but we might actually have some relation to Avowed that we can consider as the game is undergoing development. So join me, will you, as we talk about the Pargrunen Dwarves in the White March, which you can find in the first Pillars of Eternity DLC.
I'm curious. What exactly did you find there?
The inspiration for today's episode actually comes from someone I've talked about a few times now, which is Centagraphs, who's doing a lore through of Pillars of Eternity 1, and right now is in the middle of editing and uploading his videos for the White March DLC. So he's doing currently a lore through, which in my description I would call it a very thorough Let's Play with a focus on world building and the lore of the world and the characters and the stories going on. So if that's of any interest to you, I highly recommend go checking it out. I listen to probably a video of his each day. I mean, I'm caught up now, so anytime he releases an episode, I listen to it. If you are not familiar with the World of Eora, maybe watch the videos, but if you're kind of familiar already, then maybe just listen if you're busy at work, but you want to listen to something like that. But yeah, he does a good job with the editing for the video side as well. I have stopped and actually watched it a few times. So anyways, that's the inspiration for today's episode, because he was reading some lore that had to do with the Pargrunen Dwarves, and I was like, I never really talked about them at length. So I dove into it and realized there's actually kind of a connection to Avowed. It's not a huge connection, but a little bit of a connection that gives me pause to think about something that we might see within the game itself. So using the Pillars of Eternity fandom website as the main source of information for this, we're going to talk about the Pargrunen culture of dwarves, as well as a location that they set up within the White March area that you play the first DLC of the game in, is called Durgan's Battery. We'll talk about both of those things, but with more emphasis focusing on the dwarves and their culture, even though I think the article on Durgan's Battery is a lot longer. The Pargrunen, which is Pargrunen, are a distinct culture of the Aptapo mountain dwarves. So Aptapo is kind of like the cultural name given to mountain dwarves. We've talked about other races on this world, like wood elves being called Skelterfolk by the Adiran native tongue. We've also discussed pale elves being called Glamfelin by their native tongue. And the mountain dwarves, I believe this comes from the Valian term, Aptapo, which just means, I think, goat people, actually. If you go and look it up in Valian, Aptapo means goat people or something along those lines. So that's where that name comes from. I don't know if that's a derogatory or not. So the Pargrunen are a distinct culture of Aptapo, or mountain dwarf, renowned as great explorers, builders, and miners. They originate from Old Valia, though their natural wanderlust has led them to establish fortresses across Eora, including locations such as Rawatai, the Living Lands, and the White March. So a little background for those who might be unfamiliar. Valia, one of the worldwide superpowers. Old Valia is a defunct civilization. It's crumbled and it's no longer there, but it's one of the older superpowers of the world. Think of it as like European powers if you're thinking of Earth equivalents that are maybe not in the same level of power that they are now or something like that. As well, we've talked about Rawatai, which is another older superpower within the world. The Living Lands is actually kind of a frontier continent. It's not really that explored or well settled, if you will, but it is going to be the location for the game of Avowed. And then we have the White March, whatever we talked about, which is the location for the DLC that you find in the first Pillars of Eternity game. It's a very mountainous and snowy area. And as you might have guessed, it's actually this talk about the Living Lands that is the connection to Avowed that I'm going to talk about later in today's episode. And there's nothing super deep, nothing cryptic about it. It's just that they have some influence in that location, and that makes me think of like what we might see in the Living Lands that have to do with the Pargrunen or other Optopo dwarves. But talking about these dwarves in particular, their culture is unique, and it originates, as it said, from the territories of Old Valia, which we've already discussed. That Old Valia being supposedly the oldest of Kith empires. Although they are driven by wanderlust to explore and settle new territories, their culture emphasizes the unity of Pargrunen people through their distinct identity and kinship. All Pargrunen are kin regardless of where they live. And actually, if you're in the location of Durgan's Battery, when you're playing the first DLC in Pillars, there is apparently a section there for Pargrunen teachings, and it's kind of this like little, almost poetic like looking set of lines that says, "Meditate on those who came before you and those who go beyond you. Remember first your father and last your younger brother, but know all Pargrunen as kin." So there was definitely like a unity that existed within the culture of these type of dwarves. These Pargrunen dwarves, there was a unity that they had in who they were as a people, that they were all brothers and sisters within this one culture. To keep their history alive, the dwarves maintain many traditions such as cantex, which are chants and rituals of purpose. Furthermore, centers of Pargrunen colonization would also exchange stone tablets reminding them of their common root and tradition, and maintaining grand map rooms where masterfully crafted globes would show each other's location on Eora. If you're not already getting an idea, these guys are very skilled. Like, they have these masterfully crafted globes that have locations marked on them where other Pargrunen are, which again is like kind of further emphasizing that emphasis on unity. So they have all these traditions here, such as cantex, which again are chants. They have these stone tablets, which they exchange between each other. They keep track of where each other's locations and strongholds are on maps. So they're very unified as a people group, and very skilled smiths and miners as well. The Pargrunen are known not only as great explorers and builders, but also experts in the field of mining and smithing, engineering, mechanics, and animancy. The precise field of competence depends greatly on the community, so different communities would have specializations. To survive perilous underground environments, they developed a variety of cloaks, capes, and hoods that protect wearers from poisonous vapors. And so that's just a little bit of a hint as to who the Pargrunen people are. So they are as it says here, they are a culture of Optopo dwarves who have been in Rawatai, Living Lands, and the White March, setting up different settlements and exploring areas, developing their skills, etc., etc. As far as the White March DLC goes for Pillars of Eternity 1, they have set up a particular location known as Durgan's Battery. And we're going to read the history of Durgan's Battery now, which gives us a little bit more understanding of the Pargrunen dwarves as a whole. So Durgan's Battery might sound a little familiar to you if you've played Pillars of Eternity before, because it references something called Durgan's Steel, which is noted as the finest steel in the world. This is where the best steel ever made comes from. And that's where the Durgan's Battery comes in. Now, Durgan's Battery is a location, dwarven fortification high in the White March, and it is now, at this point in time, or depending on how you play the DLC perhaps, considered abandoned. And we're going to get into the history of it right now to see what happened. Now, for those of you who are interested in playing the White March DLC, I'm going to avoid any spoilers. So for those of you who have played the DLC, you're going to notice that I am leaving out a couple of details as I read along with this, and that's because I even though they're not major spoilers and they kind of get revealed pretty quickly, I really just want to include as little revealing information as possible. So one of the most stunning sights in the White March is the Battery that was founded by the Pargrunen dwarves hailing from Grand Empire of Valia. Abian's call led the settlers north. Abidan is the god of smithing and the forge, etc., etc., deep into the Reach. After generations spent living along the Pearl Coast and Erglanfath, those are two other locations on the same continent that the White March mountain range is found. In the course of their journeys, the Pargrunen located Cleabon Relag, which is a set of ruins of an even more ancient civilization known as Engwithans, and they investigated the animate forges within in their lower levels, studying the process of their manufacture and soul infusion in detail and salvaging animats for further research. Okay, so to quickly catch up, because I had a lot of interjections there, the Pargrunen dwarves were traveling through the world, and they got to the area of the Pearl Coast and Erglanfath, which you can actually go to the first Pillars of Eternity game, and you can see those areas in game. And they ended up actually finding a location called Cleabon Relag, which is, as I mentioned, an ancient ruin site of an even more ancient society known as the Engwithans. In that ancient ruin, there were animat forges, which are locations where Engwithans, theoretically speaking, would create animats, which is basically like armor infused with soul essence, so that it has the souls of people inside of the armor. There's also Adra involved as well. There's a little bit more going on there than just that, but that's kind of the quick way of describing it. They were creating these Adra armor constructs, if you will. Adra is a unique gemstone in this world that has the power to hold souls, kind of like soul gems, and so that's what these animats are. The Pargrunen dwarves, investigating these ancient ruins, saw the animat forges, researched them, and learned a lot of that stuff. And the reason that's important is because it plays into what they ended up using Durgan's battery for. The mastery of soul manipulation and transference left a lasting mark on their expedition, which pushed on further north, inspired by what they found. Eventually, they entered the White March and found the future site of the battery, a place where the confluence of magma and Adra created a uniquely powerful site. The Pargrunen dwarves, they leave Cleabon Relag, they start going further north into the White March, and they find a location that they think is very important. They find this place where magma and Adra confluence. So again, Adra is kind of like that soul gem. It has the power to move souls through it. And then magma is, well, it's magma, which those two things put together actually make a great spot for a forge. And they actually speculate that Abaddon, the god of the forge, actually used this location for some of his smithing and forging and crafting when he was in a mundane worldly form. And the article here continues to go on. It says they were somewhat correct. The forge was indeed a site of immense power, never meant for mortal use. This is where Abaddon forged his hammer and created a number of other things. But this is where the actual god Abaddon did forge things using this confluence of magma and Adra. It is a site of immense power, never meant for mortal use. So they were right in that. The dwarves harnessed the forge, building the fortress around it, a manufactory and a shrine to Abaddon. The forge proved immensely powerful. Its fires fed by streams of magma from an active volcano buried deep beneath the march and veined with Adra that runs to the center of the world. The ancient dragon carved out of stone continues its silent vigil, though the dwarves modified it extensively. So there, when you go to the Durgan's Battery location in the White March DLC, you can actually see this dragon that was carved out of stone in the actual area. Going through some details within this paragraph, essentially this ancient dragon carved out of stone was fitted with different parts and pieces and used within this forge to be the actual vehicle by which it did the forging. And it was so outfitting this dragon head with Adraspheres and golden rings, tubes, vents, steel dividers, etc., etc. They actually used this in the method to develop Durgan steel. Durgan steel became known as the finest in the world thanks to the combination of essence siphoning, excellent and consistent heat of the forge, and dwarven skill. And so that's how Durgan steel was made. It was made through this like high quality, if you will, soul siphoning, and then using the magma to create a forge that is just way better than the most average forge, and you come up with the best steel available, known as Durgan steel. And this became a major part of the Pargrunen culture's, staple. Like, this became the thing that they were known for making. Like, people still talk about it to this day. And if you manage to get yourself a blade made of Durgan steel, you hold on to it because there is nothing that can match that. So even though it's no longer being produced because the battery was abandoned, it's still like just talked about in modern day Pillars of Eternity and possibly Avowed as being the absolute best. Now, why was the Durgan's battery abandoned? The battery was torn apart by a conflict between its commandants, Chief Curate Exandru, Arms Warden Marun, and Coinmaster Zoltun. These dwarves divided themselves along ideological lines, disagreeing over the use of Durgan's steel. The three represented faith, ambition, and greed, respectively. Exandru would have them turn the battery into a monastery defended by Forge Guardians, presumably in honor of Abaddon, while Maroon would have them continue the Pargrunen tradition of expansion and exploration, bolstered by the steel from the White Forge. Zoltan, on the other hand, was interested only in money and beautifying the fortress, turning it into a palace and monument to commerce. All three refused to work together and couldn't even agree on work orders, giving Master Smith Vassell no small amount of headaches. So this ended up actually being the clincher that caused the downfall of the battery itself, because we had these three leaders within the Pargrunen culture who disagreed on how to use Durgan's steel, this new commodity that they were created. One person wanted to honor the god Abaddon with it, since basically they were using his forge to make the stuff. Another person, Maroon, who is driven by their natural dwarven proclivity to exploration, wanted to use Durgan's steel to explore even more, because now they have tools which were better than the tools they had before. And look what they accomplished with those inferior tools. Imagine what you could do with Durgan's steel. But then you have someone like Zoltan, who's like, this is something that people want. This is something we can make. We should establish ourselves here, and we should just grow and grow and grow. So there you have these three ideological lines that are being drawn here, and they're not agreeing on what to do. Now, that alone isn't the thing that caused the battery to be torn apart, but it was a major part of the recipe for disaster. Although the battery degenerated into political factions and the commandants couldn't agree on virtually anything, their disagreements were a direct cause of the collapse. The battery was invaded around 2623 AI, which is the calendar designation. This article does state who invaded the battery. I'm not including that here just for spoilery purposes, even though it's not really a big spoiler. So the battery was invaded in 2623 AI, and these invaders smashed through the dwarven defenses. Weakened by limited production and inefficient leadership, the dwarves nonetheless attempted to defend themselves against the threat. All they did was delay the invaders as they smashed through the walls, doors, and barricades, pulverizing any dwarves that stood in their way. In desperation, the commandants ordered the remaining dwarves to retreat to the forge, using its unique powers to transfer their souls out of their bodies and into the battery itself. Its doors, walls, machines, everything, and sealing the battery. The great piles of corpses eventually rotted away, leaving behind a legion of souls bound to the very fabric of the fortress with no sense of the passage of time. Okay, so you have these three leaders. They can't agree on anything. There's this infighting and political fracturing going on within the Durgan's battery, and then an invasion happens. And because they weren't working together, they didn't have what it takes to defend against the invaders. Now, arguably, they might not have succeeded even if they could agree, but regardless, that was a huge part of why they were not able to survive. And as a last-ditch effort, these leaders ended up casting their souls into Durgan's battery itself. And the other dwarves that died there presumably would have done so as well, just not on purpose. So that is going on. The reason that that's interesting and worth mentioning, because even though that's about just specific individuals in this culture, is that we might see things like that in Avowed. Keep in mind. Together with the battery, the secrets of the armory and Durgan's steel were lost. Not long after, other Pargrunen settlements across the March, like the Bone Picker or the Hawk, which are presumably two other Pargrunen settlements, were evacuated by the Pargrunen Society, who decided to return to more pleasant climates south along the Pearl Coast. And so there we have the Pargrunen dwarves and Durgan's battery. Those are the things that we really had to talk about there. So that's just one unique culture, the Pargrunen dwarves, and their history within one of their locations that they settled in, even though they settled in multiple locations. This is the story of Durgan's battery and what really happened there, about how the battery itself is a place where one of the gods actually did some of their forging, and they set up their own fortress there. To continue that, they developed Durgan's steel, which became a commodity, and they couldn't agree how to use it, and eventually they were destroyed by an invasion. And that's what happened to the Pargrunen dwarves. The leftovers of them went along the Pearl Coast. Now, the reason I want to bring these guys up and talk about them is because I think that there is some small connections to Avowed that is worth speculating on, just kind of like developing fan theories about and things like that. So let's ask the question, what does this have to do with Avowed?
Is an oath worth the wait?
of a crown.
Now, as it mentions in this article on the Pargrunen Dwarves, they came from Old Valia, one of the oldest, if not the oldest, of the modern superpowers that we see within the World of Eora at the time of Pillars of Eternity. They've also been to another location, Rauatai, which is another worldwide superpower that we still see, quote-unquote, to this day, at least at the time of the games, the White March, which we just discussed, and the Living Lands, which is, again, a dangerous frontier land that is not explored or fully settled. And it is actually the Living Lands that is the setting for the game of Avowed that Obsidian is developing currently. Now, these Pargrunen dwarves that were in the White March, very likely they're not going to be in the Living Lands, although there is a chance that they will. After the fall of Durgan's Battery, there's a chance that some dwarves would have left the White March, and some of them went to the Pearl Coast. Others of them might have decided to go to seek out other Pargrunen dwarves in other locations, such as the Living Lands. So there's a chance that we could run into families, different generations of one of these Durgan's Battery dwarves in the Pargrunen culture. But theoretically speaking, there will have been Pargrunen dwarves in the Living Lands, and they have the same proclivity to exploration as all the other Aptapo that exist within the world. So there is a chance that we will run into a decent amount of Aptapo or mountain dwarves in the Living Lands that are living in the area. They have kind of settled down and put roots in, which is not unheard of, but mostly mountain dwarves do like to get up and go. They like to continue exploring, but there might be some that decided to settle down generation after generation. So, and they would have been there far before any of these other modern day factions have gotten there to set up shop to deal with the soul plague or whatever's going on there. So they might be a good source of information for what has been going on in the Living Lands in the last couple centuries. There is more likely the chance that these dwarves that were living in the Living Lands picked up shop and left, and they just left their ruins behind. And so I think there's actually going to be a decent chance that we as players in the game are going to be exploring dwarven ruins as part of our exploration of the world. Perhaps there'll be an interesting story that we get to partake in. So like every time we find a dwarven ruin, maybe we find a stone tablet or something that talks about what life was like here in the Living Lands for my brothers and sisters. And maybe it ties directly into the narrative, because the dwarves in the White March, they developed Durgan steel, and it played a major role in the narratives for what were going on in that location. And people still talk about Durgan steel to this day. And they learned how to make Durgan steel because they studied animancy, which is the science of the soul. How do we know that the dwarves in the Living Lands, these Pargrunen dwarves, didn't play a part in the soul plague we see coming about? Like, how do we know that that didn't originate from something they created that was maybe in some of the ruins there, right? So maybe people were exploring these dwarven ruins and they unearthed something that was supposed to stay locked away that the Pargrunen dwarves made, and now the soul plague is out everywhere. Right? That's a theory, obviously, right? A lot of people are more on the bandwagon that the soul plague in Avowed has to do with events from Pillars of Eternity 2, Deadfire, depending on the exact chronology of those games. But still, it's a decent thing to theorize here, or even that the solution to the soul plague might be found in dwarven ruins. It's actually a very decent chance we will be exploring dwarven ruins or run into at least one or two instances. Now, that isn't necessarily the case. Like, the lore is here and it's consistent with that being something that happens, and I think that it is a sensible thing for the developers to include, because they're very good at writing stories in that kind of a way where you're just exploring things and you're getting little bits and pieces of narrative. So I think that's something that the writers at Obsidian would engage with, but we don't know what the exact experience they're trying to develop for us is, so they might not include anything like that. We don't know. But in my mind, it seems sensible to think that we would run into it. So me personally, I'm expecting it. I'm not going to be disappointed if we don't see it, but for myself, I'm thinking there's probably going to be some dwarven ruins and Living Lands that we run into in Avowed, and I bet you they're going to play into some narrative, whether it's a side narrative or part of the main narrative in some tangible way. And so I thought that was interesting, and I like speculating that kind of stuff. So I'm wondering, if any of you out there listening, especially if you're experts in this kind of stuff, if you have any ideas as well about this kind of thing, send me an email, worldofeora@gmail.com. Send me a message on Twitter @worldofeora. I'd be happy to hear anything you guys have to say. So that being said, that's all the lore for today. I'm going to jump into more of a games discussion section on this podcast at this point in time, just because, it's the first podcast of the new year, and I've been looking at a lot of games of the year lists and stuff like that. So I'm going to talk about some of that stuff just for my own fun sake and stuff like that. So if that's interesting to you, keep listening. If all you wanted was the lore, then feel free to just cut the episode out here. Thanks for joining me. Loved having you. Hope to see you guys next week, and I'll see you there. For those of you who are interested in talking about games in general or hearing what I have to say, then continue on.
If you find your trail has run cold, come to me with whatever you have. There is much I may be able to do for you.
The reason I wanted to do this part is just because, personally speaking, I'm just interested in this stuff. I don't know why, but I love retrospectives on the previous year for things that people enjoyed. I love hearing about people's experiences with their favorite games of a year, even if it didn't release that year, or even if it wasn't the GOTY, like even if it wasn't the game of the year that came out, the one that was their favorite and for whatever reason. There are video game podcasts I only listen to once a year at this time of year because I like to see what they thought the best game was and why. I don't know why, but it's just something I really am into. So I'm going through my list of games that I played this year, and I've come up with my top 10. And for myself, this isn't what I think is the best game versus the worst game of 2023. These are just my personal Eric Gingerino top 10 games of most impactful and most experiential in a positive way for me. And that's just kind of what I want to go through, is talk about what those games were, and then we'll close out the episode. Now, to make this short, I'm not going to talk about 10 different games. That would be kind of, I don't know, boring. I don't want to do that. So I'm going to list the top 10, but I'm not going to list it all at once. I'm going to list it in order. But I'm not going to talk about the bottom 5 in any length. I'm just going to kind of list those ones, and we'll just talk about the top 5. So my bottom 5, even though I think a lot of these games are absolutely phenomenal, for this year that I played, number 10 is Chants of Sennaar, which is a point-and-click adventure game. I played it on Steam. Number 9 is Unsighted, which is developed by Pixelpunk, and it is I guess you would call it a Zelda-like. It's got that old retro pixel art style. Number 8 this is going to be some controversy for some people, but again, keep in mind this is personal, subjective experiences only. I think that the following game is absolutely phenomenal and worth the Game of the Year title in many different respects. But for me personally, I just was kind of number 8 out of 10 on it. Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom, okay? Now, before anyone gets mad, a big reason why it wasn't as heavy a hitter for me is I think largely because my son, who was like a baby at that point, was in this stage of development where I wasn't really able to take the time to explore that game fully. So it was more about getting through the story, which is actually a great story. I absolutely love it. So I didn't really get to experience it on a full breadth of things. So number 7, a game I am currently playing and absolutely in love with, is Alan Wake 2. I wish Alan Wake 2 was in the top 5 of the category so I could talk about it more, but I'm just going to kind of breeze through it. Alan Wake 2 is the long-awaited sequel to Alan Wake 1, which is a meta-narrative game about a writer who can change reality with his writings. At number 6, another game I wish I could talk about more, but is absolutely phenomenal, is Tunic. Tunic has been on my radar for a long time, and I know it didn't come out this year, same with Unsighted, but I played it this year, and yeah, that is a game for the ages. Now, for my top 5, I'll talk a little longer, not terribly much longer. I want to kind of save anything for the last 2. Number 5 is Cocoon, a very short puzzle game. I believe it was developed by people who worked on Limbo and Inside. Very linear, so it's one of those games where it's like there is a specific solution and there is only one way to go about getting there. I love the game. It was a short one-session experience for me, which is something I haven't been able to do for maybe years at this point, and I found it very rewarding. It was not impossible to do. Like, anyone, I think, could get through that game, but there were definitely moments where it made me feel smart. I think that the boss battles were really well implemented, and they weren't samey at all. I loved the mind-bending gimmick with going into and out of different universes and holding different universes with inside other universes and then causing like weird loops within themselves and using the powers that come from that to solve other puzzles or defeat bosses. Just the overall feel of like this hybrid insectoid but robotic alien world that they were building. It was a really cool experience, and I loved it. A game in the same genre, I would say, but definitely much different. And number 4 for me was Antichamber, which came out in 2011, I think. So this game's old, but I've never even heard of it. This is a puzzle game that I can't remember how it was described, but it defies physics at certain points. Like there's an internal logic to this game, but it doesn't necessarily follow regular logic. You can go in one direction and end up on the other side of a map for no particular reason. The puzzles in this game can be very obtuse and very difficult to figure out. Sometimes you have to abandon puzzles and come back to them later. But I love games like that. Like, I love games that make me go, what the fuck did I just see? The Antechamber is that. There's no story to be told. Although I always get the feeling like there's supposed to be a story outside of the game, but there isn't. There's nothing there. It's just you trying to get out of this like weird liminal space, this weird, fourth dimensional location. I don't know, man. It's crazy. I love the puzzles in it. It gives me Hypercube feels, minus being an actual Hypercube or a horror movie where people die a lot. It's a cool puzzle game. Check it out on Steam. That's where I played it. At number 3 for me this year was Sea of Stars, which you will have heard me talk about on the What I Was Playing section on a previous episode. It is a love letter written by Sabotage Studio to JRPGs like Chrono Trigger. And this game, I think, single-handedly is going to get me back into retro-style games. Pixel art, top-down, Zelda-likes. I wouldn't have played Unsighted if it wasn't for Sea of Stars, because that game was just, I fell in love with the characters and the story. I thought that the combat was engaging and constantly evolving, and there was parts of that game that made me like genuinely curious about metaphysical things, real human questions as well. And it was such an impactful story for me and a great experience on handheld. I played it through the cloud. So that Sea of Stars, a great game, won Indie of the Year at the Game Awards, and well deserved in my opinion. Now, number 2 might surprise some of you that it's not number 1, but I will explain number 2 and number 1 in a second here. So in second place is actually Baldur's Gate 3. And in first place for me, it's Lies of P. And I'm going to explain why in a second. Baldur's Gate 3 for me, it was, you've heard it talked about a lot, so I'm not going to belabor anything here. The narratives are amazing. The execution is amazing. Everything about that game is phenomenal. I get the sense from Baldur's Gate 3 that, there are some games out there that do something that is amazing, and then other people try to copy it or try to be different versions of that, Breath of the Wild being an example. But there's something about Baldur's Gate 3 where I think people will look at that game and they'll think, that's so cool. But no one's going to try to be a Baldur's Gate 3. No one's going to copy Baldur's Gate 3 because you can't. The game is absolutely amazing, and I'm not going to talk about it much longer because you've already heard everything about it from so many other places. So Lies of P is my number 1. If you don't know what that is, it is a Dark Souls-like game set in a kind of fictional universe with Pinocchio. Essentially what it is. There's Pinocchio and Geppetto and other characters from the Pinocchio story that are there, and it's just a Dark Souls game through and through. And the reason that Lies of P is important to me, from one aspect, it's just a really well-crafted game. Like, I don't know what the secret sauce is to make a Dark Souls game that From Software does with their games, but Lies of P, the people at Round 8 Studios or NeoWiz, they got it. Whatever that secret sauce is they put it in there. Now, it has some differences, right? Like, there isn't that online aspect where you see little notes written on the ground, and there's a little bit about traversal that isn't the same from a Dark Souls game. Not that I'm an expert in that kind of stuff. But even without those aspects, like Lies of P, I don't know, man. It tastes like Bloodborne, which, saying those words out loud is a little uncomfortable for anyone who knows about that game, but it did a very good job. And that is something that I think if you're into Souls-like games, you realize how important and difficult that is to really nail down what makes a Souls-like. But outside of that, I think that ultimately the reason I liked Lies of P the most this year was because it had such an impact on me. And that was because when I hit my depression earlier this year, I was just like laying in bed doing nothing, and I just was having a hard time even just feeding myself. But when I was at home and I wasn't at work, my wife was like, hey, you got to do something. You got to read a book, watch a movie, or do something. Like, go play a game. You love playing games. Don't give up on that. And I'm like, okay, fine. And I'm not going to say Lies of P saved my life or something like that, right? It didn't, but it helped me get through a time. Like, it was part of that assistance. I tried playing Starfield, but it was too big. And if you've ever been like really, really depressed, you might understand this, of like something like Starfield just feeling too overwhelming. Even that felt too overwhelming for me, just this huge expanse of space and all these side quests and constantly having to go here and do this and do that. It just felt like way too much. And I'm like, it's stressing me out. I can't play Starfield. I needed a game that was going to be linear, and I needed a game that was going to take away my attention from my feelings and onto the game itself. And I thought, well, nothing better than focus and attention than a Dark Souls game. And Lies of P just came out on Game Pass. So I'm not, I'm already paying for it. I guess I'll give it a shot. I played that game and it did what I wanted. It was a linear path, so I wasn't overwhelmed by it. And it took all my focus to play that game because I suck at these kind of games. And I got to the end. Lies of P is the first Souls-like game that I ever completed by myself from front to back, just with my own growing skill in the game. And that's something I'm proud of. I know it's just a game, but I'm like, I got a sense of accomplishment from that. And there were genuine moments where it took me out of my own head, which I sorely needed at that time because my mental health was at an all-time low. So I think for me, that's why Lies of P is where it is on this list for the 2023, is just that personal impact. That's where that comes in, and ultimately why I think that. And it was just a great game overall. So that's my top 10 list. And I'd like to know from you guys listening here, what were your games of the year for 2023, and what are you looking forward to in 2024? Feel free to send me a long ranting thing like I just did. If you want me to share on the show, I can. If not, it could just be between you and me. I love talking about game stuff. And if you like talking about yourself or anything you enjoyed, send me an email, worldofaora@gmail.com. I love talking about this kind of stuff. I genuinely do. But I did pose a question on Twitter recently, and I put some other questions out on different Discords about, like, what was your personal game of the year for 2023? Like, even if it didn't come out that year, what was the game that, like, defined the year for you? And I got a number of responses from different platforms, and I'll share some with you now. So on Twitter, I got back responses from Eastern Bard. He says, Like a Dragon Gaiden was his game of the year, and it's a shame it wasn't nominated at the Game Awards. As well as @2_Bailey's responded, Alan Wake 2 exceeded my expectations, which I could say Avowed, but maybe next year. @Cocoon Man says, not a shocking revelation, but Baldur's Gate 3. I got an email response from a person named Pizza Dog. He gives me this list. I say he. I don't actually know, technically speaking. Number 1 is I Was a Teenage Exocolonist, which I have no idea what that game's about, so I can't even comment on it. It was alongside Pentiment and Citizen Sleeper. Means that that 2022 was one of the best years in gaming for them. This person talking, they really love Citizen Sleeper, which fantastic game, which you can get on Xbox Game Pass. Definitely try it out. And Pentiment, both narrative and story heavy games. So I'm guessing I Was a Teenage Exocolonist kind of follows that narrative heavy thing. Either any of those games sound interesting to you, that you can go check that out. As well, one of my fans of the show, he has a blog that he writes. He storyteller and copywriter J. Andrew Gula. I hope I pronounced your name right. He has the Backlog Awards. He has some stuff in there that he mentioned that I just kind of want to point people towards because, I don't know, he puts his stuff out there, so I'm assuming he wants people to read it. Hope he's okay with that. Here's me giving you a shout out, my friend. But yeah, he did a 2023 Backlog Awards, so these are games that he played as part of his backlog. I'm not going to talk about the bottom half of his top 10 because I don't want to go too long here. But I'll take a look at the top half of his top 10, and I'll just leave it at the game titles. So number 5 is Hi-Fi Rush. Number 4 is Tears of the Kingdom. Number 3 is Overwatch 2. Number 2, I guess, would be Pokemon Scarlet. And number 1 is, oh, look at that, Citizen Sleeper. That's not terribly surprising given the conversations he and I have had. This is definitely something that would be in his vein. Yeah, those were his best games this year, at least for part of the Backlog Awards, as he calls it. So if you're interested in reading gaming blogs from fellow gamers, if any of those games like stood out to you, like you align with that kind of stuff, then maybe his blog is something you'd be interested in. He talks about more than just gaming on here, but that was something that I definitely leaned towards. So go free for you to check that out if that's something that interests you. All right, thanks everyone for joining me on that. I know that last half is not something I usually do, but I like talking about games, and this is a podcast about a particular set of games. And it's my podcast, so if I want to talk about this, I'm gonna. If it's not interesting to you, I gave you fair warning that you didn't need to listen to it, so this is on you. But no, thanks for listening. If this kind of stuff interests you, I genuinely love having gaming conversations. So if you're ever looking for someone to ask nerd questions to, send me an email, World of Eora. While you're doing that, follow me on Twitter @World of Eora. I will update stuff about the show quite often. And going into 2024, I don't have any overarching goals. We're looking forward to Avowed coming out this year, right? So this is the year Avowed's supposed to be coming out. I mean, obviously, there's a chance for delays, so we'll just manage our expectations. That's fine. But hopefully it comes out this year. That'll be very exciting. It's going to be a lot of work on the show, but I'm looking forward to it. Other than that, yeah, nothing about the show that's new. I am considering I'm going to be honest with you. I am considering doing sponsors and advertising for the show, just because I've had a couple hiccups with my PC, and I'm like, if I want to keep doing this show, I need to keep my PC alive, and parts aren't cheap, and I don't make a ton of money. So I'm like, well, even a little bit here and there from ad sponsorship might help. I don't know. I'm thinking about it, but I don't want that to be something that detracts from this experience. So if you really hate that idea, send me an email and let me know, and then I'll know not to do it. But otherwise, it's something I consider. Thanks everyone for listening as we discussed the Pargrunen Dwarves in the first half of today's episode, how we might see them or their cousins or descendants in Avowed, and then just kind of talking about Games of the Year list from 2023. Thanks everyone for listening. That'll be all for today. Thanks for staying with me for this long of a time. I've been your host, Eric, aka Ginger Reno, and I'll see you guys next time.